Funding for Poets and Their Craft on Vermont PBS is provided by Phoenix Books, with stores in Burlington, Rutland, and Essex, Vermont. Phoenix Books, supporting our communities in everything we do, from books to authors. Details and information at phoenixbooks.biz. Vermont College of Fine Arts, located in Montpelier, fosters the excellence of established and emerging writers, designers, artists, composers, teachers, and filmmakers through its graduate-level programs. Learn more at vcfa.edu. Northshire Bookstores, fostering discovery and serendipity for babies to the ageless, committed to building community one book at a time, with locations in Manchester, Vermont, and Saratoga Springs, New York, and Middlebury Breadloaf School of English and Breadloaf Writers Conferences attract emerging and established faculty, students, and writers from around the country. A summer tradition for more than 90 years.
Hello, I'm Tamara Higgins. Former Vermont Poet Laureate Sidney Lee has been described as a man in the woods with his head full of books and a man in books with his head full of woods. A finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, recipient of fellowships from the Rockefeller, Fulbright, and Guggenheim Foundations, and founder of the New England Review, Sidney brings his passion for the wilds of New England and the tenacity of its people to his work, which includes 12 volumes of poetry, a novel, and a new collection of essays. At the Norwich Bookstore, he presented his take on interweaving narrative values with lyric presentation and poetry. But first, here's Liz Bernard, co-owner of the Norwich Bookstore.
Poetry speaks with a voice that nothing else does. I mean, oftentimes when one is describing a wonderful novel, they say it's a poetic voice. It's a voice, it's a use of language that is only in poetry.
What would John Milton, who came to hate rhyme, by the way, calling it the invention of a barbarous age, what would he have thought of fellow non-rhymer Walt Whitman, for example? What would Milton have thought even of William Wordsworth? What would Wordsworth have thought of Emily Dickinson? What would Dickinson have thought of Ezra Pound, and so on? I begin in this way just to indicate that nothing I say tonight has doctrinal value. I try never to make the claim that's not poetry, simply because there have likely always been almost as many different notions of what poetry is as there are poets. That I have no sweeping take on what poetry may be, and even if I did, it wouldn't be very important. What I'll really be talking about tonight is my own practice as a writer, and my practice is my practice not because it represents the right way, but because it's my practice, if you'll allow me a little circular logic. I never know where a poem is going to go when I start. It often starts with a snatch of conversation that I've heard or misheard, or something that I've read that has intrigued me for reasons that I'm not really quite sure of as I explore them. Poems for me are ways of finding out what I didn't know I knew, or what I didn't know I was thinking about. The title of my presentation suggests that I want poems which invite readers in, rather than ones which exclude them. And that's what, in my opinion, narrative values can help us with. It's certainly not the only thing. Mind you, I say narrative values, which is not the same thing as talking about writing narrative poetry with actual plot, beginning, middle, and end. I've written a certain amount of such poetry myself, and I've surely enjoyed it in others, all the way from the extraordinary epics of Milton and Spenser, to much of Frost's longer work, the Ellen Bryant Voice, Kyrie, to a lot of Sharon Olds's work, to the superlative story poems of B.H. Fairchild, perhaps my favorite poet writing, to wonderful stuff by Maine's poet, Laureate Wes McNair. How are we to know, leaving your two kids behind in New Hampshire for our honeymoon at 21, that it was a trick of cheap hotels in New York City to draw customers like us inside by displaying a fancy lobby? Arriving in our fourth-floor room, we found a bed, a scarred bureau, and a bathroom door with a cut on one side, the exact shape of the toilet bowl that was in its way when I closed it. I opened and shut the door, admiring the fit and despairing of it.
You discovered the initials of lovers carved on the bureau's top in a zigzag, breaking heart. How wrong the place was to us then, unable to see the portents of our future that seemed so clear now in the naivete of the arrangements we made, the hotel's disdain for those with little money, the carving of pain and love. Yet in that room, we pulled the covers over ourselves and lay our love down. And in this way began our unwise and persistent and lucky life together. And I think that inclination to story, perhaps especially in the physical details that the poet so cannily remembers and turns to his use, is patent in this quirky and wonderful love poem. One gets a very clear sense, for one thing, of that character named I.
If we can introduce into a poem, for example, a recognizable character, whether that be the speaker, him or herself, or not, then at least the reader has that to go on. I can know this much. I know who's talking. And ideally, I know to whom he or she is talking. And if it's relevant, it may be important, and it's often relevant to me. Where is that person as he or she is speaking? It's a way of inviting the reader into the poem, in effect.
If as poets we present complex material, we're already challenging our readers to pay very close attention. There's no speed reading of poetry, no scanning for story. Why would we want to expand that challenge to include what I've called simple facts? Who, what, where, why? Again, the presentation of such facts is what I call the invitation to the reader. To use the famous example, that reader may say, this is tough stuff to sort out, but at least this much I can know. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveler long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. We have a starting point for the famous instance I use here. A sort of door has been held open to us as we move into the poem, though even if it's reduced to a mere pep talk for self-reliance too often, is in fact profoundly ambiguous and finally even mysterious, perhaps like all good lyric. No, the inclusion of narrative values does not dumb poetry down. In fact, the introduction of such values is often very subtle, even oblique, rather than in your face or simplistic. Consider this poem by the late James Wright, one of my favorites, by his hand. Autumn begins in Martin's Ferry, Ohio. In the Shreve High football stadium, I think of Polacks nursing long beers in Tiltonsville, and grave faces of Negroes in the blast furnace at Benwood, and the ruptured night watchmen of Wheeling Steel, dreaming of heroes. All the proud fathers are ashamed to go home. The women cluck like starved pullets dying for love. Therefore, their sons grow suicidally beautiful at the beginning of October and gallop terribly against each other's bodies. I remember seeing this poem early on and concluding that it was clearly a first-person commentator's indictment of a social structure that's ruinous and whose priorities are badly skewed. I thought of, high schools where we can't afford advanced placement textbooks, but we hire a new football coach, at great expense. And I think that element is in this poem, but not so fast. Because if we go back to those basic narrative questions, who's talking to whom, where, and why, we discover in the very first line of the poem that the speaker is in the Shreve High football stadium. So he is somehow implicated in the very spectacle that he talks about. He sets it up to sound like a syllogistic poem. The one the one word in the poem that has its own line is therefore. Okay, so here's this sterile and dehumanizing and brutal social context where even the night watchman is a ruptured night watchman, and therefore their sons grow suicidal? No. Do they grow beautiful? No, they grow suicidally beautiful. So he's at once participating, he's participating in this event with all the ambiguity that good lyric always has associated with it. He's making a judgment of one kind at the same time that his mind is making a judgment of the other kind. And it's by scrutinizing those narrative values that we get into, I don't like to use my students' old term of deeper meanings, but the deeper implications of the poem become more obvious. And that phrase, suicidally beautiful, is one of the poetic triumphs, I think, of 20th century lyric. Here's another example by the wonderful former poet laureate of Delaware, Fleda Brown, with whom I co-authored a book on becoming a poet. It's obviously a sad story, and one familiar to any of us who have said goodbye to a strong-willed parent, one who stirs in us both affection and resentment. What I should have said. Crossing back on the Mississippi Bridge, its harps lilting away, small islands, whispering shades of gray, and the trees, banks, frozen river, all textures of hoarfrost. What I should have said to my father was sure, call me Cordelia, old fart. Facts. Stick to facts, you taught me. There is no God. What I know of you is ancient and hard, lacking this recent sentimentality. Stone in the road, stone in the throat. Back when all should have been possible, but wasn't. Oh, how we suffer. How we all suffered with it. A lifetime of watching you build a boat to sail away in. Shall I now be the one to watch over you as you navigate the ashes, shivering thin? I didn't say the most important thing, did I? Suspended this pageant of anguish. When I was 12, I flew into a rage, stomped out to the yard. You typed the letter, folded it into a paper airplane, and flew it out to me. I only remember it said you didn't understand me at all, but you loved me. Did it say that? Was love part of it? I mostly remember the distance, the trembling anger, that nothing would bridge between us, that I would love and hate you forever, equal portions, taking care not to love so much I'd never escape. It's an unpublished, very recent poem. We've been giving each other assignments. I think it's a knockout, and I told her so. That is, to repeat myself, complex stuff, but to quote the poem, much of what Brown does here is stick to the fact. The point of view, the circumstances, even the physical ones are clear, though its subject cannot be reduced to one meaning or message. One of my favorite quotations from Robert Frost is, if you're looking for a message, call Western Union. In the late 1970s, I read an essay by the fine poet Brendan Galvin on poems he called Mumblings, in which an unidentified I, quote, tries to tell the reader how he ought to feel about the nonspecific predicament of another, often unspecified person. Yes, I thought, or else the poet addresses an unidentified second person about the cloudy difficulties of his or her relationship with that second person, or yet a third, also unidentified. I too dislike the verse that Brendan attacked, especially for its evident assumption that a poet, merely by so designating him or herself, could lay claim automatically to an interesting inner life. Because after all, a poet is ever so sensitive. Surely, I believed, an I was interesting only if he or she proved to be, which meant, among other things, that he or she must cogently reveal at least a hint of identity in the writing itself. Not that all the 70s poets mumbled in the way that Brendan had mocked. Some relied on image, whether deep or shallow, plain or surreal. And yet these writers, too, seemed often to exclude me from their work's deeper resonances. Just as I was expecting some authorial commitment, a poet would turn to notice, say, a pigeon carrying a snip of someone's necktie through a rain cloud or whatever it might be. Subject matter, so to speak, never quite came out in public. Image is crucial to poetry, of course. It is at the root, etymologically and otherwise, of imagination. Much good and even great poetry has relied on little else. But if you have any yen for testimony in a poem, it's important to remember that the image has no voice. I'll address that issue of testimony in a moment. For now, what I'm suggesting is that a lyric poem ought to have subject matter, and that subject matter should extend beyond the joys and frets and desires and worries of one's solitary self. This is true even, no, in my opinion, is true, especially in first-person poems, too many of which, it seems to me, are vaguely akin to certain messages sent out on Twitter. Frankly, I don't give a damn that you're well pleased to have made a money-saving purchase at Costco, and I'm not, to stay with a technological analogy, interested in your selfie. I've found narratives to be a check on my own narcissism, which is as pronounced as anyone, as I admit, but here's another opportunity it can provide, something more positive, and to me more intriguing, though it may not be, and need not be, for everyone. It could open my poems to what I just call testimony. I could also call it rhetoric, in the classical sense, the language of persuasion, of argument, even of abstraction, which we're too often told witlessly not to engage in. Why should rhetoric, so understood, be a goal at all? I'll answer indirectly. Having not only conducted but also visited many a workshop, I've often noticed a kind of anti-rhetorical rhetoric among teachers and participants implicit in the mantra, show, don't tell. Over and over I've heard this buzz phrase, and I've usually been polite, but I've been thankful that most of our revered poets never paid any attention to it, whatever. Consider, for example, the ceremony of innocence is drowned, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Even though Yeats himself polarized rhetoric, which he said came of our quarrels with others, and poetry made of quarrels with ourselves, he went ahead and composed that great sector, the Second Coming, which is rhetorical to the core. Or, for further example, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers, little we see in nature that is ours. Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That's all you know on earth and all you need to know. Publication is the auction of the mind of man. Poverty be justifying for so foul a thing. Time present and time past are both perhaps included in time future. The list could be endlessly extended, but whoever our tastes, few would think immediately to send the authors of these telling lines, Wordsworth, Keats, Dickinson, Eliot, respectively, few would think of sending them back to the workshop for the sin of too much telling. The plain fact is that to banish rhetoric, to banish telling, to banish abstraction from lyrical poetry, that would be to banish some of the most memorable lines in our poetic history. Poetry, for me, is a way of discovering connections that I didn't know were there. I don't keep a journal anymore, and I'm not quite sure why, but for years and years I did. And if I wanted to write a poem, I would turn to that journal and take 3 random entries and assign myself the chore of writing the poem that connected all 3 of those entries, on the premise that they must have something to do with one another, merely because I'm the one that wrote them down. And I never know where a poem is going to go when I start. It often starts with a snatch of conversation that I've heard or misheard, or something that I've read that has intrigued me for reasons that I'm not really quite sure of as I explore them. Poems for me are ways of finding out what I didn't know I knew, or what I didn't know I was thinking about. Let me close, as I am apt to do with Robert Frost, and with a reference to a poem whose rhetoric is easy to hear, since that's almost all there is. Provide, provide, is chiefly persuasion, verging even on preachiness. The witch that came, the withered hag, to wash the steps with pail and rag, was once the beauty Abishag. The picture pride of Hollywood. Too many fall from great and good for you to doubt the likelihood. Die early and avoid the fate, or if predestined to die late, make up your mind to die in state. Make the whole stock exchange your own. If need be, occupy a throne where nobody can call you crone. Some have relied on what they knew, others on simply being true. What worked for them might work for you. No memory of having starred atones for later disregard or keeps the end from being hard. Better to go down dignified with boughten friendship at your side than none at all. Provide, provide. If you're counting, you'll see that this poem offers 4 short lines of showing. The witch, the wretch, the withered hag, came the clean with pale and rag, was once the beauty, Abishag, the picture pride of Hollywood. And then it offers 17 lines of nothing but telling. Not a trace of image, none of metaphor, not a single so-called poetic device of any kind, whatever, except, of course, for rhyme. But note that these opening 4 lines, the lines that show, constitute a narrative. However minimal, famous beauty becomes crone. Period. On the strength of this short story, the author moves straight to rhetoric, which begins as rhyme musing, and though Frost doesn't purge the wryness, he rarely does in any poem, concludes as a realist argument. No memory of having starred atones for later disregard or keeps the end from being hard. Better to go down dignified with boughten friendship at your side than none at all. Provide. Now, if you agree here that Frost, quote, gets away with flouting the show don't tell injunction, you may see that he does so precisely because in that opening mini-narrative he has shown. Narrative is his means to that end of rhetoric, of argument, persuasion. You may not buy the argument, but you'll hear it out because you know where that argument is coming from. It's a little bit hard to decipher the argument at all, but it is definitely one. As so often with Frost, you have to make up your own mind about what he's up to. Had that opening mini-story not existed, you'd have been tempted to dismiss everything that follows as mere opinionation, unassociated with any recognizable reality. Narrative is the very grounds on which the poet bases his conclusions, ambiguous as they remain, as always in Frost. Once again, that is, I think this poem passes the who, what, where, why test, and it shows that a writer needn't overdo the narrative values of his or her lyric. We know just enough about the speaker's identity and provide to feel invited in. It's enough for us to understand that he is one who has seen a formerly beautiful and idolized woman reduced by circumstances to meniality. We know the where aspect too. He was on hand to make the observations. Just to sweep the step was all, to clean the step. We need no more location. In very brief compass, that is, Frost earns his authority to comment. As I say, not everyone may aspire to rhetorical poetry, to testimony. And even I have a satchel full of Frost poems that I prefer to this one, great as it is in my opinion. Maybe my interest in narrative as a means to argument has simply to do with my being contrarian by nature. If I'm told I can't do it, I want to try. Or related, that interest may come from the sort of Frostian impulse he describes in 2 Tramps in Mud Time. It's no moral failing if you don't share that impulse. As I've said right along, I can only speak from my experience as writer and reader. It's not the right experience, unless you want it to be. To quote that great liar Donald Rumsfeld, it is what it is, and here's what it is. My object in living is to unite my avocation and my vocation, as my 2 eyes make one in sight. Only where love and need are one, and the work is play for mortal stakes, is the deed ever really done for heaven and the future's sakes.
I think that there's a thirst in people for memorable language and distinctive language. It's under threat all the time from the language of advertisement and corporate biz speak and so on and so forth. For those of us who value the not only the sound of language, but all the implications, all the historical freight that a given word bears into our presence. It will go on. Now, how it's going to go on, I don't know. I'm asked this all the time. You know, what is the future of poetry? Poetry changes all the time.